And then there he introduced, and John came to bear witness. Towards the middle of the chapter 1, Onah John now say, I am not the light. And I said, why are you baptizing Christ? Verse 23 of chapter 1 also that voice, as Isaiah said. But the emphasis on the word. John. Without that word, John would not have had any voice. John was only a voice, not the word. He was a reflection of the light, not the light. Unu mara ihe Jesu jiri sị na n'ihe niile ime mọrọ na o nwego ihe ruru nke John the Baptist. Mana onye kpazụ na alaeze karịrị John. Why? Gede ndọm na alaeze ọkwa anyị ba na-ekwu maka ya. We are the words, because the word became flesh and did what? And dwelt among us. John enwere this experience because he didn't live the experience of the crucifixion, death, and resurrection of Christ. He didn't have it. John in the desert, John was able. He then had a voice. He then became a sound. Many of us are only making empty noise. Because there is no word in you. If there is no word of God in you, your voice is empty. And that is why many of the places are in Nigeria now, so he know there noise from 7 p.m. till 5 a.m. Morning praises, night praises, midnight praises, 3 o'clock praises. To the extent, the Catholic adoration. Adoration of what? Adoration of the Word made flesh that dwelt among us, that before he left, made bread and wine, his body and blood, that flesh. He left it for us at the Eucharist. I enjoy to adore him. I make it pot. Make it pot. Take it. I will take share in my or have a miracle. Before you misunderstand me, ask him let you want to get a miracle there. I am not God and I cannot limit his operations. He does. Because any place his children gather, praying to him and believing that he will grant their prayers, he will. He will. But what I'm saying is that I am matter what we are worshipping and doing as Christians, Catholics. Now that word that came to John and transformed John and made his voice heard and powerful, and made Herod afraid of that voice. The powers that were at that time became afraid of a man named Why? He had in him the word of God. And of course you know, John was already disposed to understand that word. Immediately the mother of Christ, of Jesus, met his own mother. The child leapt in the what? In the womb. Where does the word meet you? Where do you encounter the word? Or does the word come to you at all? Yes, if you want. But the word that was with God, that is God, through whom everything was made, that word that became flesh and dwelt among us is first and foremost encountered in the Eucharist. In the Eucharist. Maka na okwu nke Chukwu dị n'akwụkwọ dị nsọ The Word of God in the Bible is the real Word of God. But it is not the same as the Word of God in the Eucharist because of the real presence of Christ. You encounter the Word of God in the Bible, but you encounter Him primarily in the Eucharist. Ọ ga-abịakwute gị ma ime ya obi gị were okwukwe gụma Baịbụl gị ọfụma. Ị na-agụ ya n'okwukwe, you encounter the Word of God. But primarily, you encounter Him each time you celebrate and especially receive the Eucharist. Now you understand, maka ndị n'ime unu bịara cathedral last 2 Sundays, Christ the King. Unu anụghọta n'ihe m na-ama n'ọkwa. Maka ndị na-esoro John jee the desert na ha chọkọ Word of God. Asị m ha, ị na-eje the desert nta, ị bụ John. Maka na ndị ụka anyị ga-abụ ma onye chọọ ebe ọ ji ejekwute ahụ Jesu Kristi ekpe ekpere n'ihu nke Chukwu, ebe ọ ji anata ike nke mmụọ nsọ, ọ yara Blessed Sacrament ebe Jesu nọ really present. Okwukwe anyị na-agwa anyị jere n'ime anyị. Mara na amara, we have no desert in this country anyway. Anyị ga-enweghị a desert. Na ịchọkọ desert na iji agba ihe ụgbọelu. Now, you can encounter God in the silence of the wilderness, yes. You can encounter God in the separation and isolation of whatever you call desert in Iman, yes. I agree. But bear in mind, you faithless Catholic, that there is no prayer you can say any other place that will be as powerful as the prayer you say in the presence of the Blessed Eucharist. None. Because there you have Jesus really present. And if John had the Eucharist, he probably would not have gone to the desert. Makangba jasina Bishop Onah so in the desert. Ask him get the desert. No, big bali konu jekon desert. Mara no chuki he yaki he yakone Blessed Sacrament the he church on desert. If the desert you are going to is a supporting theme to your experience of Christ in the Eucharist, beautiful. But once you make it an alternative, you have missed route as a Catholic. And don't forget, not every Christian believes in the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. So when you believe in that presence, you won't blame him if the only place he feels he can encounter Jesus on a desert. Or desert here. You encounter the Word. You encounter that Word in the Word of God and in the Eucharist, and then you can become a powerful voice. If you go, however, to Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3, that is quoted in these passages, you notice nowhere a little difference. I am the voice crying out in the desert, vox clamant in desertum. Prepare the way of the Lord. But if you go to Isaiah 43, what you read is a voice crying out. Prepare a way for the Lord in the desert. They are two different things. One says, the voice is crying in the desert, prepare the way of the Lord. Another one says, the voice is crying, in the desert you should prepare the way of the Lord. Why? Isaiah was addressing, like Baruch, today in the first reading, he was addressing the people of Israel in exile. Their agreement was to obey the commandments and follow the word of God, and God would always guide them. But they decided to behave according to their own will and no longer following the will of God. And after a long time of suffering, of dialogue, after a long time of disagreement, after a long time of attempts to make them understand the only way they can have peace, and they refuse. And they were conquered and taken away and put in exile in Babylon. And that is the psalm we read. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. And those people were teasing them. When the wicked carried us away into captivity, requiring of us a song. But how can we sing the lost song in a strange land? I was Bonnie M. Let the words of our mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord. In that state, Isaiah appeared and said, now the Lord will act. Jail those on the desert, because I will lead my people back. If there is any hill that will prevent it, it must be knocked down. Only any hole that will prevent this, cover this hole. Make a highway. Make a highway, another highway that will come. In the desert, because who's are in a desert? Now that is the third point, the desert. Our souls, our hearts have become deserts. Our country has become like a desert. Our dioceses, our parishes, our homes. Now Christ is coming to encounter his people again. Christmas na kwada anyị maka encounter Jesus na ndị nke ozuzu Jesus na ezute ndị nke. Kedu nkwado ị na-akwado? What way are you preparing for him in that desert that your soul has become? In that desert that your family has become? In that desert that your parish has become? O nwere double bomb na parish anya. Bomb. Oh, we got that. My motto game may be put in the head. Now, you must know the hand on the parish, otherwise, nothing will happen. When the mountain, when the bone, no, he's so head, that pure. And in every family, it's also the same way. There are things that have constituted themselves into bumps, mountains, hills, gullies, and valleys. Christ is telling you to cover them up. You can do this. In here with the grace of God. And that is what it means to prepare for Christmas. But first of all, open yourself to an encounter.